How's everyone doing today? All right, excited for this closing conversation, hopefully? All right, thank you. I like the enthusiasm. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you all for continuing to stick around for the last session of the day. Hopefully it'll be inspiring. I'm really thrilled to learn from this group of wonderful experts and scholars in the space. So I wanted to quickly do a round of introductions, who we have joining us here today. To my right, we have Shantanu Sinha, VP of Google for Education. He also helped start Khan Academy and has been in education for over 15 years. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Next up, we have Chris Piech. Did I get that correctly? Okay. Assistant professor here at Stanford in both computer science and education. He helped to start Code in Place, which he'll talk about with you all, which has helped to teach CS virtually for free to tens of thousands across the globe. A really exciting opportunity to learn more there. And last but not least, we have Drew Bitt, who's a Stanford GSE graduate, started Schoolhouse as part of Khan Academy, and is now leading higher education initiatives at Anthropic. So, round of applause to welcome our panelists. Thank you. So to get us started, and just a little bit about me, I'm Allison Scott. I'm the CEO of the Kapor Foundation. We're located across the water in Oakland. And our overarching goal is to build a more equitable technology ecosystem that can address societal and humanity's biggest challenges. So we're very interested in, and we believe in the potential of AI, similar to many of you who are in this room today, especially in the fields that have experienced longstanding challenges and inequities. And so in education, we really want to know, how can AI be best harnessed to improve education? How can we improve learning? How can we close equity gaps for marginalized students? How do we prepare young people for a very different future than what education traditionally has been created for? And we know that this can't happen without intentional focus. So hopefully this conversation today will illuminate opportunities and implications for AI's equitable integration into education and learning. So to start us off, as AI systems are increasingly integrated in education, how do we ensure that these technologies close and not widen existing opportunity gaps? And maybe each of you can share a little bit about what you've seen, what you've learned, and maybe something that gives you hope. Who would like to start us off?
All right. Yeah, it's great to be here, and really I'm looking forward to the conversation here. And by the way, I knew Drew for a really long time. He was actually a high school intern when I was at Khan Academy, so we're actually longtime colleagues over 10, 15 years or so. In terms of like the impact on closing equity, it's actually something I've thought a lot about over the years. And one of the things that you get with technology adoption is initially you do have this risk that the people who are going to adopt it are the people with more means. They're the people that have access to the devices, have access to the connections, have the motivation. And even in the early days of Khan Academy, I remember hearing, like, being asked the exact same question, which is the people who will come are people who have a device, they have high bandwidth, they can stream YouTube videos, and they have motivation. How do you make sure you're reducing the gap versus expanding the gap? And I think one of the things that you definitely see with technology adoption is that over time, there might be some near-term impacts, but over time, you can really raise and level the playing field and raise the floor. And if I think about, like, let's fast forward 15 years from those early days when we're putting YouTube videos, where really only a segment of the population was using it, to today, where YouTube has billions of users around the world. I think recently we saw in a survey, 93% of people who use YouTube use it for some form of learning and informational intent. It's in the most remote regions of the world, and if you go to a village in India on their Android phone, they're watching educational videos on YouTube, and it's like remarkable. And so over time it gets there, and I'm pretty optimistic with the role that AI will have here, because one, we already see in the last few years, the cost curve of what's happening is dramatic. I mean, it's bigger than Moore's Law. I mean, you're seeing like 10x reduction in the cost of delivery. You have these open source models that are coming out, which really open it up for large access to a lot of people. You have on-device models where you can now do pretty impressive things just on a cheap Android phone. And I think that trend is just going to really continue over time. So as technology adoption gets there, I think it really does start to make it far more accessible and more equitable.
Chris, do you have some learnings and ideas coming from your experiences?
Yeah, I'd like to plus that. This is a very exciting time, and you can imagine for folks around the world, this is a great opportunity. For all of us, you can imagine the things that you don't know now. We now have ways to get past those barriers. So truly exciting. But maybe just to be playful, I could push back on a couple of things. One thing that makes me concerned is the job part of it. There's like what we're able to do and what we know. I think this is going to be a wonderful moment. But I spent the summer in Kenya, which is where I grew up, and I would say the level of concern I saw amongst people who were learning entry-level data science was much higher there than I would say I experienced in the Bay Area. So there's maybe this growing fear of winner takes all. Whether or not that's true, we'll find out. And then there's this other part of me that wonders if this might be different than like early days of YouTube, which is access to the highest end models is very valuable. Like being able to program with the most recent version of large language models feels pretty different. And so are the students who are from more marginalized communities, are they going to be getting access to the same ones? Yeah, so I suppose my first concern was I think you're right. But my first concern is that actually maybe the job market could be hit in a different way. And the other concern would be who gets access to these models, because they are sometimes expensive. Like the cutting edge ones are a really different price point. And so will that drive inequalities in a different way than, say, YouTube access?
Yeah, I think the access point, it's not just theoretical. When we talk to students across college campuses, they often put them into two categories. The students that have the pro versions of these AI models and the students who don't. And they have dramatically different types of learning experiences now. Especially we've talked to a lot of business school students about this. And so I think that is worrying. To Shantanu's point, the costs are coming down, but we need to do more there, both from a cost perspective, but also from just like an awareness perspective. I think the other thing is in how we design the models. When we think about access, that needs to be baked into the models from probably the earliest levels. Right now, so much of the conversation in AI has been around increasing the IQ of these AI models. But I think especially for education, the EQ part is really important. And so if we are on the precipice of having an AI tutor or an AI coach or an AI assistant in everyone's hands, we want that to be able to work with learners of all different backgrounds and be able to accommodate all of their needs. And that requires very high EQ. And so I know just at least at Anthropic, that's something we focused a lot on is the character part of it. And I think that's also going to be a key part to make sure that this is broadly available and helpful for all types of learners.
Super helpful. Hello? There we go. Super helpful. And if I could add one additional thought that kind of keeps me up at night is how do we think about both the utilization of tools and also preparing young people to be critical consumers of those tools, and how are we integrating both together, and are we focusing more heavily on one or the other? But I think there's a ton of opportunity to do both. We know that many of the AI-driven tools that we've seen have great potential to scale learning experiences globally. And Chris, you've seen this firsthand, and Shantanu as well. However, how do we ensure that the scale does not come at the expense of pedagogical depth, cultural relevance, and also relational aspects that we know are so critical to education? And you all started to touch on it, so I would love to hear additional reflections.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. Okay, I want to go. It's so interesting, right? I really love the presentation before about this learning through creation, because that's the place I'm most excited about, like the ability of students to make things and that to turn school from maybe a drudgery to something they're very excited about. I think there's so much potential there. And maybe I had this one interesting moment of caution. So we run this code in place class, 10,000 students every year, 1,000 teachers, and it's also this great test bed for different technologies. So when we have new ideas in artificial intelligence, we can A/B test them and see how they impact different learning outcomes. And I think that's a little bit special. I think there's a lot of people throwing AI tools out there without the ability to find out, is this actually benefiting our students? Last year, we did this interesting experiment that had two parts. One part, we got everybody from 150 countries who was in the experimental arm got early access to a GPT tutor. And on another arm, their students were able to be helped by humans. So if a human says, I want to help somebody, they could drop into their sessions. And the results were quite interesting, right? The control group, you can call them neutral, did pretty well.
the folks who got access to humans, so there would be something like near-peer teachers, people with a little bit more experience coming in and spending 15 minutes with them, 10 percentage point improvement in completion. It was very exciting. And then on the other end, the students who had early access to a GPT-4-based tutor, they might have done better in the class, but they were dropping out at 3 percentage point larger growth rate. And I don't know what that told me, but maybe one of the takeaways was, I'm excited for generation, but I feel like when we get to these sorts of basics of education, I suppose we shouldn't throw out the basics. Like, humans can be really inspiring. Great content, great pedagogy can matter. So I suppose there is like excitement and room for caution.
Yeah, and and that's a really interesting study. One of the things that reminded me of is, when people are using technology, and particularly students, they're really bad judges of, they think they know more than they do. And it actually reminds me of, when my oldest son was learning to ride a bicycle. And I made the mistake a lot of parents do, which is I put training wheels on, and he's all excited, and he's going from point A to point B, thinking, oh, I'm really good at riding my bicycle. And I just could not get the training wheels off. And you take them off, and he throws a fit, and I'm like, okay, I got to put the training wheels back on. Until one of my friends came and said, you really made a big mistake that you should not put training wheels on a bicycle, because what that does is, like, if you think the skill of riding a bicycle is learning how to pedal, that's great. But it takes you like 30 seconds to learn how to pedal. The skill of riding a bicycle is learning how to balance. And by putting the training wheels on, you're taking away your ability to actually focus on the skill that matters. And I actually think, it's really interesting studies about like how people are adapting to it, but like you do have this impact where students will often think they know, or think that they're learning really well with AI. They're getting help, they're like, oh, I get it, and it helped me through that process, but they're not necessarily practicing the skill that actually matters. And I think that is where the role of the educator, to me, is like the most critical part of this equation. Because the educator can come in there and say, well, actually, it wasn't about getting the answer right on a piece of paper. That's like pedaling to the end goal. It's not even about writing a 5-paragraph essay. That's just getting from point A to point B. It's about the critical thinking. It's about the communication. It's about the teamwork, the problem. Like those are the skills that you're really trying to reinforce. And I do think as we think about how we bring this to at scale, it is going to just be so critical to think about the human systems around it so that people are actually embracing the technology the right way.
I think there's also a shortage of creativity with what these AI and education interfaces can look like. We're so stuck in the sort of chatbot format that it's hard to think about alternatives here. And I think chatbots generally work very well for productivity and in work use cases, but you don't interact with the teacher through a chatbot, and for a good reason. And so I think we've seen a little over the past year with things like artifacts, or I think Google's Notebook LM, of just showing what do different media look like, either on the creation side, like Chris was talking about, or just different types of interactions, which you can't always find a human analog of what a student and an AI are able to do. And so I think we're just at the early stages of trying to figure out what these new interfaces look like. And I think many of you here are trying to build those, and I think that's really important.
Follow-up question related to some pieces that you all touched on. And what do you see as the evolving role of educators? So if we were to think about not just the technology, but the ways in which educators, which have been so critical to the outcomes of students, are able to adapt and utilize these technologies in the most effective ways. Like, what do you all see as some promising examples of like the new potential role of educators? And you all have highlighted the importance of educators continuing to be critical in these conversations.
Yeah, I think educators are really kind of the linchpin of education systems, and I think there's a few things that we're seeing. So one is, I've been pleasantly surprised at how quickly educators are embracing AI to help themselves in this way. I think it's one of the things where like there was kind of the knee-jerk reaction when these chatbots first came out, like, oh, maybe it's used for cheating, et cetera. But now you do see a lot of educators saying, well, this actually helps me write these emails, all these tasks, because any task an educator does, you have to multiply by 30 to 100. So anything you do, it's like a lot of work. So, AI can have a huge impact here. And we've even seen, like a few months ago, on search on Google, if you typed AI for, the first autocomplete was AI for teachers, which surprised me. And then I thought, maybe that's because I'm in Google for Education. I did incognito mode, and it still worked. It was still the first search. It was actually the first autocomplete. So it's actually one of the first areas you're seeing real strong market fit for. So I think the first step is, how do you actually help educators scale themselves, get time back? And we're spending a lot of time thinking about that and focusing on that. Then I think the second part is, the role of the classroom is going to evolve, like I was saying before. I think the reason the educators are so important, they're the ones who can look at that and say, don't focus on pedaling, focus on balance. Let's make sure that we're actually developing the skills the right way. And I think that's, I think there's a lot of exciting stuff there, but there's also a lot of change, right? In terms of like, how do you bring this stuff into the classroom in a reasonable way? And that is definitely going to be something that it's super important. And we spend a lot of time thinking about, how do we support educators through that?
I think a lot of teachers could probably tell a story similar to what I'll tell, so I teach this class, Probability for Computer Scientists, and over the last year, our ability to give feedback to students using AI has dramatically improved. So we still have humans in the loop, but our teachers, they're first doing a DPO process where there's suggestions coming from a large language model, so we're able to grade orders of magnitude faster. And of course, we're doing the obvious thing with that. We're spending all of our extra time with one-on-one FaceTime with our students. So now each of my TAs is spending 12 extra hours one-on-one with students. And I feel like that's made all the difference. So maybe the AI is buying us time on things like grading, and then we're able to help people. The other thing that I'd add to that is in Code in Place, there's two contentions. We have one teacher for every 10 students, and it's obviously because we think teachers are important. So like, I'm hard on the teachers are important here. But there's this flip side to that. I think teaching is important. In this moment where we might see a split between entry-level jobs and those who are really advanced, we are going to need more people and more places where you can do something on your career path. Teaching is what a wonderful thing to do. You get to share your knowledge with others. So I think there'll be more demand for people who want to teach.
I mean, there's an argument to make that in an AGI world, a majority of people will be teachers. So much of education is about, or should be about, social development, turning people into great citizens of the world, thinking about agency. And a part of it has become about learning skills that will lead into jobs. But I think that's actually distracted education from its core goal, which is to bring together communities socially, and why we have a public education system. And that's the foundings of the US public education system. And the last 100 years, it's become very much about social mobility and leading into jobs. But that starts to break down in a world where, if you just think about it, by the time that AI can teach a student how to do skill X and skill Y, that AI can also do skill X and skill Y itself. And so if we're basing all of our education right now on teaching people how to do these skills that they'll then use in jobs that the AIs are going to be able to do, that's a losing battle right there. And so we just have to remember that education and our education system is not just about learning skills. It's much more than that. And so I think, at least from the K-12 picture, I think this is very clarifying, actually, for the education system.
Perfect transition into the next question, which is even beyond things like automation and efficiency, how do we think about using AI to unlock human potential in learning? And we've often heard and talked about learning looking very different from what it's looked like in the past. How do we enhance curiosity, creativity, lifelong learning if we're going to see massive changes in the job markets? How do we think about learning in a totally different way? So curious your perspectives, both from industry and from higher education as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm some of the stuff Chris was mentioning about the creativity in the prior presentation. I'm super excited at the potential there. I do think it is so important that we actually really spend a lot of energy experimenting and defining new type of pedagogical experiences that can be used that unlock that. And I do think, as you start to see with AI right now, the content transformation piece is huge, right? Like Notebook LM, as Drew was mentioning before, you could take now a text of something is turned into a podcast, and that's just the beginning, right? It's not that far away before you can imagine, video on the fly that's personalized to me, or very different type of experiences. And this can explode over the next 5-10 years. So what type of new experiences can happen in the classroom? I'm really excited about things like, now a kid can really, they can, when I was a kid, if you wanted to make a video, I mean, I don't know, we take some camcorder out and it'd be like some really sad thing. Now they're making like Star Wars quality, like special effects and like really like amazing, like the tools that they have are incredible, right? So I do think that opens up all kinds of project-based learning, all kinds of new experiences for students. I also think AI can be used in such different ways, moving away from those traditional assessment models of the 5-paragraph essay or the multiple choice exam, and more into, okay, let's have a debate with an AI on this topic and really like test how well we understood the material, like the Harkness table that Phillips Exeter used to have. Like maybe you can have those type of experiences now with AI agents, and I think that, again, it'll take some time to explore and figure out how to bring that to users, but I think all of that like speaks to where the future of these educational experiences are going to go, and how it's going to move away from lecture, homework, tests.
Yeah, for example, we've seen students at Stanford use Claude where they, to be aligned with the Stanford honor code, they'll upload their syllabus, they'll upload the course's AI policy to tell the AI to follow that AI policy. And then they will, either they have an oral exam, one of these classes where like every week they have to meet with a TA or a professor and they get quizzed on how well they know the material. As a side note, those professors could probably also use AI to start to scale that up. But what these students have started to do is that they are doing these mock oral exams where they then ask the AI to quiz them on as sort of stress test their thinking around these concepts so that they can come in really prepared to these real oral exams. So I think there's going to be lots of use cases like that. I think the other shift that I see happening with learning across a bunch of different fields is there was always some distribution of work spent learning how to generate content or type of work, and then reviewing and evaluating. So for example, if we just look at English classes, at least I remember in my classes, we'd spend 90% of the time on the generating part and then 10% on the revising part. It was kind of like a last minute thing you just added on. Now with AI, at least in terms of like how people are using it in their work, so much more of the generative part is something you're doing in conjunction with the AI, and now you have to spend way more of your time revising and editing. Same with code generation. Programmers in the past spent all of their time writing the code, and then it was kind of, you would do the code reviews as just like a formality almost. Now you see some of, at all of these AI labs and everyone using these, latest AI models, a lot of time is spent reviewing code, not from necessarily other humans, but maybe generated by AI. And so our education system spends a lot of time teaching the generating part, not always the reviewing and the editing part. And I think there's a key question here, which is how much do you need to go through the generation part in order to be good at the revising and the editing part? Because you clearly can't just go straight to the editing part and the having good judgment part and having good taste part. And so I think across all of the education field, we just have to know where it's headed and then sort of work backwards to figure out what do we need to teach for students to get there.
I have a few more questions. I think one on the positive side. What do you think is the most exciting or unconventional way that you envision AI shaping the future of education, if you haven't already mentioned it? And then I'm going to ask the converse as well.
Maybe I can start with that one. I think you guys might know that I wrote a book with my then 2-year-old daughter. I feel like this was eye-opening for me. I just it saw the generation and the thrill it gave her. I'm going to actually, and then certainly there's an element of we have people writing code by hand that they can take photos. I'm very excited about that. But I think I actually want to focus on just programming for a moment. I think a lot of people in this room are programmers, and can we just note that this is the most exciting time ever to program? We think that these large language models are good at English. No, they are amazing at Python. They're so great at JavaScript. And if you know that foundation of central programming knowledge, I spent 5 days programming, and I did in 5 days what I used to do in like half a year. And I felt like it's so empowered. There was a moment when I was worried about these large language models like taking over all of our jobs. And then like the thrill of those 5 days, and I'm like, oh, I want this for everyone. I want it for my daughter. I want it for all of you. I mean, I think that actually programming and being able to take visions of what a computer could do from your mind and turning it into reality, getting that into everybody's hands, teachers' hands, you learn that nugget that underlies, the core principles of Python, and you can go on a road trip that will allow you to create things that you could have just imagined before. Isn't that an exciting moment?
I agree with that. I mean, but it does speak to like where's the future headed? Are we going to be programmers? Are we all going to be product managers? Or just like envisioning these things and like,
You asked me last year, I would have said product manager, and you asked me today, I'm like, I'm a programmer. And in fact, actually like a mathematician. Like I've done proofs that I was, that pushed me farther than ever. And I used to think we would just be programming, and then one day LMs would be so good we would stop. And now I'm convinced it's like the transfer from when we did machine code to Python. It didn't stop people from programming. It's just programmers could make orders of magnitude more. There's a Cambrian explosion. I think we're not going to be product managers. I think we will be creators. And just the things we can create, maybe in an afternoon, my dreams will come true.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I think like if I think about the future, it is the creation aspect that I think is just mind-blowing. It's creating programs, it's creating podcasts, creating videos, it's creating anything. Like that is where we're headed, and I think that is also where like the power of these AI models in some ways, like that's where like hallucination is no longer a flaw but a feature, because it like helps us think in new and different ways and bring it. So I think it is one of those areas where that like I think we're still in the very early phases of understanding the implications of that when creation becomes that democratized, across all these different fields.
I agree. We at Schoolhouse, my previous role that's listed up there, we have a programmer on our team who was a chemistry teacher, and she late in life learned how to program because she wanted to teach her students about how to balance some charges. And so she Googled how to program and found Scratch from MIT, and took a year to figure out how to build these interactive activities that she could then share and practice problems she could share with her students, and then they could use her creations. And that's really inspiring, and actually what I love about it is then she learned how to program, she switched into software engineering, and we were able to bring her on to work at Schoolhouse. But unfortunately, she's the 1% of folks who are going to be able to make that transition. And so to Shantanu and Chris's point, I was just talking to a teacher about this yesterday who just, in the course of a couple of minutes, just spun up a interactive flashcard app for her students using Claude. And that's incredible. If now every teacher can do that, every student can do that. And so yes, I think if we take this seriously, of everyone, whether we call it a product manager or a programmer, I don't really care. It's some hybrid. We see product managers becoming more like programmers and programmers becoming more like product managers. Everyone is going to be like that. Teachers are going to be like that. Students are going to be like that. And so it is just incredible when you have 1000x amount of code getting generated every day. And anytime you have a thought, some code gets generated to help create that thing for you.
Just one more question. I think this has been a really exciting and inspiring conversation, and not intending to end on a negative note at all, but I think it's important to also think equally clearly about potential risks. And so if we think about the broader AI space, and we know that we've talked a lot about the importance of harnessing AI's great potential, and how do we think about harnessing that potential in education. What are some of the risks that you all are seeing that we as a community should be very intentional about addressing? And also just acknowledging like the current state of K-12 education, as I'm hearing all of these like really exciting ideas, and understanding many of you who work day to day in education spaces, and there are so many structural challenges that we're still trying to deal with. So how do we balance both the exciting opportunities with the realities of the day-to-day context that we're discussing? So potential risks.
I mean, I think the first one is just we spent so much time talking about the technology, and we're all programmers, so we've converged on that is a very important thing, and I think it is. But as has been talked about at this summit, we really just can't do technology for technology's sake. And I think the reason why all of us got interested in education was for equity reasons. And the reason why I've joined an AI company is because I think AI has the potential to really close these equity gaps, but just as importantly, has the potential to actually widen the equity gaps if we're not careful. And so that is exactly the type of challenging area that I like to work in, is where it's like we can help steer things in the right direction. But there are risks. And when we talk to students and professors are still worried about cheating. I know a lot of people say that's over, but I think every single institution, every single individual is on a different part of that path of going from AI being used for cheating to this transition to AI being used to transform learning and teaching. And still many, many people, including many of the professors at a lot of these top universities, are worried about that. And then the students, just as importantly, are worried about brain rot. And this is something that's really interesting. As we talk to students, there's more and more of a concern of, I'm offloading my thought to an AI. It's the short-term solution to get to completing my assignment, but it's going to hurt me in the long run. And I think this is a failure of our tools if we're not able to, students, they have the right intention, but if we make it so easy for them to go down one path, they will go down that path. And so I think there's a lot more evolution we have to do there. So those are the things I'm thinking about, and there's many others which you'll hear from.
Yeah, no, I would echo that, and I think like probably one of the things we say at Google is we're going to be bold and responsible, and the responsible part's a really important part of that statement. And it is this like misapplication of AI that I think is one of the biggest risks, and you see that, and it's important to recognize like the forces for that are actually really, really strong, which means that we have to be very, very cognizant for it. So there's one, as Drew was just mentioning, is like like students are bad judges of this stuff. They'll offload things. Learning is struggle. Like you have to have productive struggle, and everybody wants to make it easier, but making it easier doesn't make it better learning. And it's really hard to get that balance right, and it's really hard if just technology and the user is trying to get that right, because the end user, technology is just going to support what the user wants, right? So it's really hard to make that balance right, because you need to have products that are used and all of that. But I think even on the educator side, right? I mean, I think one of the first things with the cheating risk that came out is people like, well, I need an AI detector, and you have people like, okay, we could like figure out these AI detectors, and we looked at that at Google and like, that doesn't make any sense. You can't really build an AI detector that has like any level of like confidence, but the demand was really, really high. People really, really wanted it. People went out there and said, here's an AI detector, and it does this thing, and people were like adopting it. It's like, and you say like the risk of that, the misapplication is huge, right? If you have an AI detector that's like 10% of the time telling the teacher that a student cheated when they didn't cheat, like what does that mean? Like from a education system, the biases, all the different things that might be happening there. And I think, and when you see all the new stuff that's coming out, right? Like these models are amazing. They're getting like 80% on the AIM exam, which is a really hard exam in the math exam. But the 20% they're getting wrong, right? So what about that 20%? And what does that mean when that's just being thrown? And as we were saying before, people will trust this stuff more than they should in many cases, right? You're in a self-driving car, you're going to be like, okay, it can drive. After 5 minutes, you're like, okay, it seems like it can drive. And it can now. It was very, very well. I tested it out. But it is one of those things where like that last 5 and 10% is where like all the work is, like all the work. And it's so important for us to really just be cognizant of that. And recognize the forces where people will try to use this thing in some ways that it's not really ready for. And it takes you have to be really focused on the responsibility part of that.
I'm listening to responses. I'm going to go with kind of one word, and then I'll explain myself. Loneliness. I think this is the biggest risk we've got. And then I'll explain it, which is, I came from AI. I spent my PhD coming up with algorithms that folks at like Duolingo will use to trace your knowledge. And so I came from this perspective. And then I had this experience of seeing how much human teachers mattered to students. And I've been spending the last few years reflecting, why was that getting such a lift over the AI? And I had different theories. My first theory was some sort of AI identity threat. Do you guys know identity threat? It was like somehow if you have to confront your identity, it could somehow distract you from your learning. I was thinking that we were identifying as humans being confronted with an AI that was very powerful and that was preventing. I actually don't think that's it. I think it's just human connection is so deep in our minds. And if we start thinking we can have an AI tutor replace your human tutor, then I think learning will slowly become learning could become lonelier. And the students might do well for a little bit, but are they going to do well over 10 years' time and over 20 years' time if they're starting to feel more unsure of their place in the world, unsure of their connection to human society? So I think we should all be thinking about this a little bit. How can we work towards a vision of a future for education that's not just making us all more skillful, but also making us feel more connected to our fellow humans? And so there, I'll go with loneliness.
That was excellent. Thank you for ending us on that note. And I think this has been a really inspiring and engaging panel. And I think, Isabel, if I'm correct, I think we might have time for some questions.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe first a quick round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
That was awesome.
Shantanu, when on YouTube can we watch a lesson of Chris and interrupt him and ask him a question, or he ask us a question?
Well, I do think so. By the way, on that, the podcast generation thing, now we actually have rolled out the ability that you can call into the podcast on Notebook LM and interrupt it and ask a question in the podcast. And it's actually kind of a surreal experience. So it's not very far. I can't speak to YouTube's product roadmap plans or anything on any timeline on that. Video generation is quite more intensive than audio generation. But that is this interactive experience is not that far away.
But that's an interesting example of the symbiosis of where the AI does really well and where the humans do well, because Chris is a personality and all of his students love him and they love him because he's a human. But it would be cool if they could watch your recordings afterwards and also engage with you maybe at scale, thousands of people around the world.
Yeah.
As someone who doesn't write a lot of code, but I can write code if needed, I'm excited about the prospect of LLMs writing code for me. But I wonder about what happens when things go wrong. Do we have a generation of people who are going to get used to this and not be able to find the mistakes? Maybe this is an instance of brain rot that you've discussed, but how do you think we're going to deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, it reminds me of when we all had the navigation systems in our car, and now all of a sudden, you can't you're in a new city, you can't drive anymore. You can't figure out how to get from point, because you just completely offloaded your sense of direction to the computer here. Or if you're lost without your phone, all of a sudden you feel oh my God, So I do think there's a real big risk there. And to me, the fundamental thing it comes back to what are the skills that we're going to keep needing, and what do these professions move into, right? If it's I would imagine you're still going to need, well, I don't know, I mean, it depends on how good AGI gets and all of this stuff, but I would imagine that ends up becoming more of the important skills for a lot of these professions, is being able to, anybody can draft a lot of code really quickly, but how do you bring it together? How do you really make it work? Ends up becoming a really important skill. Maybe AI gets really good at that, and then you can offload that thing. I think there's always another skill that becomes important, which is really where we need to focus on.
I love that question. I'll just really quickly, but I guess the question is this another layer of abstraction? There was this moment where we do machine code, and then we invented this layer of abstraction, and it's Python and human readable coding languages, and that was fantastic. Is this just another layer of abstraction, or is it deeper? And maybe we'll just leave that as a question.
I'll try to answer.
Oh, okay.
The rhetorical question. I think AI can also help you go, if done well, into lower levels of abstraction. And if you're working with the AI and there is an issue, you can actually pretty quickly, if you wanted, get to the machine level code and sort of have it explain to you in a targeted sense what you need to know. So I think the other part of this also is with all the latest reasoning models, having good chain of thought where you can also see having some auditability of these models, and then thinking through the learning side of this so that you can learn how to start to understand the machine's version of thinking and go back and forth. I think that's important because yeah, if you just like make a huge change to your code base and you don't know what changes it's making and you can't audit it, then that's a problem.
He's got, he's got one right after.
Okay.
Oh,
No, you can go first.
So thinking back to like the dawn of social media and the like current situation and fallout from that, where we're learning about mental health issues and misinformation and impact on democracy and elections, what do you think are the like potential future doomsday impacts, and how can we safeguard against those? I feel like this is like the next thing, and it's a little scary that we're guinea pigs in this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I heard like Anthropic, a lot of people have a really high P-doom ratio. So I was going to, like, which is the ratio? People,
Every
yeah.
meeting starts with it.
Well, what your P-doom ratio is fine. I mean, I do think like, I do think there are real risks there. And I think it is just kind of like when you're in the precipice of the unknown, and I do think things like loneliness, things like dependence on technology, like it will change. It's, obviously, I'm sure even with my generation, like people like watching TV, and I remember my teacher thinking like she would call the TV the idiot box because we weren't reading anymore, and like everybody changes. Ultimately, did that make us worse or not? I don't know. And now we look at the mobile phone. I think things will keep evolving. It is hard. It is change though, right? And I think like we are definitely going to miss aspects of what society was like, and there's going to be aspects that are like a million times better in different ways. And I think the best thing we can really do is, really keep an eye out on the risks. And I think the long-term risks of like dependence on AI or getting attachment or people personifying AI and like there is a real risk to a lot of that stuff. And I personally think you have to be very, very careful with that stuff, particularly when you're dealing with, under 21, under 18-year-olds, and really like be very cautious with a lot of that.
Can I add one quick thing to that one? I think as someone whose background is in education and not in computer science or engineering, I think a lot about all of the over 100 years of scholarship that we have on like child development. And so I think something that Shantanu said that really resonates with me is, what are we trying to solve for? Like technology can't solve it all, and technology is not the silver bullet, but if harnessed correctly, it can be very powerful and do some really amazing things. So I think we still need educators, we still need education researchers, we still need that the integration of that knowledge into everything that we're doing, the technology development, investment, policy, et cetera, or else we're going to over-index on technology and we're going to miss all of the things that were already mentioned here.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to speak about something that doesn't seem to be a consensus on right now, and which is ownership. In the context of education, when you were talking, you were like, when you do this with AI, and you talk about the code, you're like, okay, you generate this thing, you modify it, and just fine tune it, and technically becomes your own and stuff like that. Yeah. But recently, I think I saw in the news, maybe 2 days ago, a student from Minnesota, it's like, okay, I used AI, didn't use AI, just, accusation. It's like, okay, no, I did my thing, it's my thought, I put it in AI, fine tune it, becomes my work. And I feel that's something that maybe out there in the industry, it's like, clear, just the end justifies the means. But in education, it's like, okay, this is not your work. And just how do you see that, moving in the next couple of, years, just your stance about that, what does ownership, what would ownership look like? Yeah.
I think it's an open and interesting question. It's something we've been thinking about a little bit too, because I think you're exactly right. Like, if my daughter writes a book with ChatGPT, but it's done all the illustration, is it her book? And actually, some of her ideas, to be honest, she was too. They're a bit derivative from another book that we were reading. That's not that important right now. But I think there's an interesting intellectual problem an intellectual problem we could pose, which is how could we quantify how much you own in a process? And I think there's like, how many decision points did you make? And I feel like there's a way we could start to talk about what does it mean to own a product and what percentage you feel like you contributed to. So I think this is a cool question. We'll come up with some neat answers, but I don't have them yet.
Awesome. Hey guys, my name's Tyler Wright. Shantanu, you talked about some cool stuff around being creatives and sort of accelerating ourselves to that. Chris, you sort of mentioned the same, like whether we're product managers or coders, or we're probably a lot of things, I think, is probably part of the answer. And then Drew, you talked about like, let's not train ourselves to the things that are actually getting solved for, which are like a lot of the jobs sort of today. And so where that leads me to think is that there's this tension that's going to start to arise around the way we look at curriculum today and its ability to evolve or advance. Like, if we can have two PhDs in the same time it takes to get one, then our tied downness to both grade and progress start to challenge, time as well as what we're learning, like what's in the curriculum. I think there's this interesting tension to question curriculum, and I want to put it to you guys to say, it's such a foundation for what teachers teach to today, but that is sort of the foundation that needs to think about evolving. So I wanted to get your guys' opinions around the tension on curriculum and its ability to sort of keep up or to lead where we want people to get to next, to get to these great multi-creator states as you guys described.
I 100% agree. I think so much of the conversation around AI in education is using AI to change how we learn, but more importantly, if we look a little ahead, is changing what we learn. And I think there are some analogies I've heard people share that are interesting until they break down. For example, even after the Industrial Revolution, we still do physical labor in the context of gyms. What does that look like for learning even when we don't have to learn a skill for an economic reason? What is the equivalent of a learning gym? What's interesting about that is if you take that idea seriously, then the concerns around AI for cheating, even ownership, all of that, start to look a little different because we worry a little less about cheating in gyms. But there is an agency problem in gyms of things that we feel like we should be doing versus what are we actually doing. And so I think there could be similar analogs here in education. The other sort of anecdote I'll pull out here is, if you look like before calculators, people would learn how to do logarithms by hand, long division by hand. After calculators, we don't really learn how to do logarithms by hand, but we still learn how to do long division by hand. And so even if everything can be done by the AI, there's still some thought that has to go into what are the things that are still worth learning versus not. And it would be nice if we could just bring together all of the minds in this room and just backwards plan into figuring out what those things are.
I also think there's a difference in that question of like higher ed versus K-12, right? I think like a lot of the K-12 education, ultimately I don't know how many, I guess maybe it's more academics here, but like balancing chemical equations and the stuff that I did when I was in K-12, they weren't really economic value skills, right? The reason for the learning was the thought process, the problem solving, seeing if my mind can learn new concepts. That's what it actually was about, right? And I do think that is actually what a lot of education is. So, but I definitely agree. Like the skills, the what is you're gonna have to question, right? Like if any AI can balance my chemical equation perfectly, it's become this amazing calculator for like every task. How much do I still need to learn that? But I think it still goes back to a lot of education are those other skills. It is the collaboration. It is the critical thinking. It is all of that. And that's what you actually do in your jobs and for the most part in real life. And I don't think that ever goes away, right? And I think part of the reason long division is still taught is probably because it is important for you to learn how to follow rules, and it's still probably important. Like there's aspects of it that are still valuable. And I think that's always going to be the case.
One small dissent. Just like, I guess I don't have to teach K-12. And actually, by the way, I have a lot of appreciation for all these meta skills, how to choose the right problem, and how to learn, all incredibly important. But I'm excited that I get to be in this slightly free place where I get to change my curriculums and I get to think, okay, you've learned to code in the same way for the last 20 years, but now we can rethink what that looks like. And as a teacher, that's exciting when I'm given the space to do it. I still want shared experiences for my students, but I feel like learning to code must be different in the next few years.
Hi, thank you so much for this inspiring panel. So my question isn't about AI's impact on education, but on AI education, or AI and computer science education. And it's twofold. It's a bit controversial. I'm sorry. So I run a pre-accelerator training program for aspiring AI startup founders, including founders who do not come from technical backgrounds, people who did not study computer science, but are now, it's too late for them to go back to undergrad, and they want to build AI products. And so in my program, we chose to adopt teaching AI product development using no-code, low-code tools, something that I think the Stanford Computer Science Department is not yet fully willing to adopt. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, no.
So my question is twofold. One, if you were in our shoes and you were teaching non-technical aspiring founders who come from social impact fields like education, climate, sustainability, people who want to have impact and want to build AI products to drive impact, how would you teach them if they don't come from technical backgrounds? And if we use no-code, low-code tools, what are the basics we have to cover? And second, in your opinion, what is the future of computer science education? I know Stanford might be the last place on earth to adopt teaching computer science using no-code, low-code tools, but when do you think that might be possible? 10 years? 5 years? Thank you.
Can I take this one? Okay. I love the question, and I'm going to qualify everything. I could be wrong. I could absolutely be wrong. So first of all, I'm really excited. Did I tell you about teaching these humanities professors? I'm going to be teaching this group of 10 humanities professors. They came to me. They're like, we want to learn how to program, not because we want to be computer scientists. We're like very successful professors around, and I'm so excited to teach them. It's going to be so much fun. Now, I have an opinion. I could be wrong. That English is not precise enough for describing the world, and I believe that programming is a slightly more precise language. I also think that there's such a small fundamental core to programming that you could learn all of that in about a 2-week intensive experience, and then I think beyond that, very soon you will not be needing to learn all the extra APIs. So to that extent, because of those two reasons, that I think English may never be precise enough. And because I also feel like that shrinking core of what you would really need to know to feel like you have mastery over this, I am continuing to be in the camp of, I'm going to teach you the fundamental skills, and then I'm going to watch you flourish, and you'll be able to go towards low-code experiences very quickly. So maybe I'll be low-code with you, but I can't. Maybe the no-code's the right answer, and I'm so stuck in my ways. That could be that could be the case.
And maybe tactically, for low-code, no-code, from a few years ago, there were different tools that would do that. I would maybe encourage that with these students and with everyone that you just go straight into the coding editors themselves, whether it's a Cursor or a Windsurf or a GitHub Copilot, because the secret there is that the programmers are doing what some people call vibe coding, but it is low code. Programmers are doing low code now. And the tools are pretty powerful, but to the earlier point, they don't abstract away all the code, and I think that's important. And importantly, they won't just write code for you, they'll also answer questions about the code. So when I'm programming and I'm in a new code base, I'll spend 9 out of my 10 requests, won't be asking it to write code, it'll be asking it to explain where in the code base this particular feature is implemented, or why does this code work that way. And it is actually the perfect educational learning experience if you just know you can do that. And that's how you take someone who's never used code before, and then they can learn how to program. They can do it in the process of building a project.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time to take all of the questions. This has been such a great conversation, both with the panelists and also your questions have been really thought-provoking. I have a lot to think about when I go home tonight, but we want to make sure we get you all out in time for the reception. So thank you all again, and appreciate your contributions to this panel.
Thank you. That was very fun.